I'm Melvin L. Raymond, attorney and counselor at law. Welcome to Raymond Law Live. Today is Tuesday, June 18th, 2019. We invite you to tell us what topics you would like us to cover that meet your needs on a future broadcast. Simply email us we have a new website, new email address. It's raymondlawlive@gmail.com. Again, new email address, raymondlawlive@gmail.com. That's a little shorter than my other email address, so contact us there with your topics of choice and we'll cover it on a future broadcast. And of course, you can also reach us on our Twitter. That's Twitter at Raymond Law Live, or you can call us at area code 314-534-2800. On our last broadcast, we discussed the topic of protection of the elderly from financial exploitation. On today's broadcast, I'm going to continue discussing protection of the elderly. Today, we're going to focus on protection of the elderly from abuse and neglect. Protection of the elderly from abuse and neglect. Here in the state of Missouri, and also in a number of other jurisdictions in other states, not only is financial exploitation of the elderly crime, but also abuse and neglect of the elderly. And that happens, abuse and neglect, to people of all ethnicities and income levels. And there are different kinds of abuse and neglect, be it physical, sexual, or emotional in nature. So let's talk about what is elder abuse, the criminal offense of elder abuse. Elder abuse is the infliction of physical, sexual, or emotional harm, including financial exploitation and bullying by any person, firm, or corporation. In addition to an elderly person, and as you recall from our prior broadcast, elderly person is any adult age 60 years or older. And the law also protects from abuse and neglect persons with disabilities and what the law refers to as vulnerable persons. So that's a third category of persons who are protected by the Missouri law on elder abuse and neglect. In addition to what I just described, infliction of physical, sexual, or emotional harm, elderly abuse includes two other things or acts. One is the intentional failing to provide care, goods, or services to an elderly person, a person with a disability, or a vulnerable person if the result of the conduct would cause a reasonable elderly person with a disability, or a vulnerable person to suffer physical or emotional distress. And the other act of abuse or neglect is knowingly acting or failing to act in a manner which results in a substantial risk to the life, body, or health of an elderly person, a person with a disability, or a vulnerable person. So all of those protections are covered by the Missouri statute or law on elder abuse and neglect. Now, there also is an exception regarding the offense of elderly abuse if an elderly person or a person with a disability or a vulnerable person chooses to rely on spiritual means through prayer in lieu of medical care or his or her health care, as evidenced by such person's explicit consent, advance for health care, or practice which in this case would not be considered as abuse. So, an elderly person or a disabled person can decide, and there would be it would not be a crime if they decide that they want to forego medical care in favor of spiritual means, and that does occur. So that's an important exception. Another thing that's covered by another protection that's covered by the Missouri elder abuse statute is bullying. That refers to intimidation or harassment that causes a reasonable person to fear for his or her physical safety or property, and it may consist, for instance, of physical actions, including threatening gestures. It could consist of cyberbullying or oral, electronic, or written communications, and any threat of retaliation for reporting acts of bullying. So that's covered as well. Now, what is neglect under the Missouri Elder Abuse and Neglect Statute? Neglect is the failure to provide services to an eligible adult by any person, firm, or corporation with a legal or contractual duty to do so, when such failure presents either an imminent danger to the health, safety, or welfare of the client, or a substantial probability that death or serious physical harm would result. So that constitutes neglect, which is also a protection that's covered by the Elder Abuse and Adult Statute. The punishment for committing the offense of elderly or a person with a disability or a vulnerable person abuse or neglect, this is a Class A misdemeanor offense. It's punishable as a Class A, so it's a crime punishable as a Class A misdemeanor, and a Class A misdemeanor is punishable by imprisonment not to exceed 1 year. So that's in Missouri, and also in the other jurisdictions that have statutes making it a criminal offense to commit elder abuse or neglect. They also have criminal penalties if you commit those offenses. Now, there are mandated reporters in Missouri. That is, there are certain individuals who are required by law here in this state to immediately report or cause a report of suspected elder abuse to be made to, in Missouri, is the Department of Health and Senior Services. So certain individuals, we'll discuss those individuals in a moment. We invite your questions or comments. You can go to our Facebook page at Raymond Law Live, or you can tweet us, or you can go to our email address. That's raymondlawlive@gmail.com. So we invite you to send us your questions, your comments during the broadcast. Now, who are the persons who are required to report suspected elder abuse or neglect? The first category, and this is very important because some people think that if they're not a state employee or not working for a nursing home, that they're not required to support or report to the Department of Health and Senior Services suspected abuse or neglect. Well, if you are any person having a reasonable cause to suspect that an elderly individual presents a likelihood of suffering from physical harm or bullying, as I just explained, under the law, then that person would be required under the statute to report that to the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. Now, that would include, for instance, ministers, coroners, anyone who has a reasonable suspicion of elder abuse. It also includes, believe it or not, embalmers and coroners or medical examiners. So embalmers, if they suspect that there's been elder abuse or neglect, then they are also required to report that to the Department of Health and Senior Services. Now, there are the other two categories of persons who are required to report suspected abuse or public employees who are employed, for instance, by any state agencies such as the Department of Social Services or the Mental Health Department or the Department of Health and Senior Services. Also employees who may be employed by a local area agency on aging or any local agency that may operate a aging services for the aging, and again that would include individuals ages 60 years or older. So state employees, public employees. And the third category of persons who are required to report suspected elder abuse or neglect is, of course, healthcare workers, and that includes not only physicians, physical therapists, but also nurses, nurse practitioners, chiropractors, pharmacists. The list of those healthcare workers who are required to report is quite long. It would also include, of course, any personnel at nursing homes. It could be a private nursing home. Any abuse that they discover or they suspect, they are also required to report that to the Department of Health and Senior Services. Now, as I mentioned in the first broadcast regarding Part 1 regarding elder abuse, the Department of Health and Senior Services runs a hotline. That's a 24-hour hotline, and let me give you the number for the hotline again. That's very important. So it's the Missouri Health and Senior Services Elder Abuse and Neglect 24-hour hotline. That number is, and it's a nationwide number, 1-800-392-0210. Again, 1-800-392-0210. So that's the hotline number to report any suspected elder abuse or neglect. Now, to enforce the reporting requirement in Missouri here, the lawmakers have made it a failure to report suspected abuse or known abuse as a crime itself, and it is a Class A misdemeanor. So it's a crime not only to commit the offense of elder or elder abuse or neglect, but also, if you know about it or suspect it, to fail to report it. That's also punishable as much as it is if you were a perpetrator. Mandated reporters are immune from civil or criminal liability unless they act negligently, recklessly, or in bad faith with a malicious purpose in making a report of elder abuse or neglect to the Department of Health and Senior Services. Being immune from criminal or civil liability means that you cannot be sued for making a report or of known or suspected elder abuse, and that is a very important protection. You can even, if you desire, make a report of suspected elder abuse or neglect by calling the hotline and anonymously and not giving your name. Some individuals do make reports anonymously, so it's really important to protect elderly individuals and persons with disabilities to report it. Even if you choose to do so anonymously, do that. Also, let me talk for a moment about abuse and neglect in nursing homes. It happens that many of our seniors are nursing home residents, and there are special provisions dealing specifically with nursing homes to protect nursing home residents. The law in this state here in Missouri imposes strict strict requirements on administrators and personnel who work at nursing homes, including, as far as the requirements, to report any known or suspected instances of abuse against nursing home residents. So they are strictly required to do that, to report, and reports of abuse, of course, must be made to the Department of Health and Senior Services immediately upon discovery. Knowingly, if a nursing home personnel or administrator knowingly fails to report suspected abuse of a nursing home resident, they may be charged with the criminal offense of adult elderly abuse and neglect, and they could be prosecuted for that, as could anyone who fails to report. And as with other categories of individuals who report suspected abuse and neglect, there is immunity from civil or criminal liability for individuals who report abuse, unless, of course, they are the abuser or the nursing home personnel have acted negligently, recklessly, or in bad faith with a malicious intent in making a report of suspected abuse. In addition, those who operate or direct or are in care or authority in a nursing home, they are prohibited from firing, harassing, or retaliating against any employee because they report suspected or known abuse or neglect, or they cannot retaliate, fire, or harass any family member who may have reported suspected abuse or neglect. So that's a very important protection for those who may work in a nursing home or a family member who reports suspected abuse or neglect of a nursing home resident. Very important protection. Now, what happens when a hotline report or a report of elder abuse or neglect is made to the hotline at the Department of Health and Senior Services? The Department of Health and Senior Services are required to investigate all allegations of abuse or neglect. So the workers at the Department of Health and Senior Services, when they receive a report, they must promptly and thoroughly investigate. And the investigations, how long they take or the duration could depend on the number of witnesses. Typically, during that investigation of a hotline report, they will interview various people, including the person who made the report of abuse or neglect, and also any other individuals who may have knowledge of the abuse or neglect. So that investigation will take place, and when the investigation is concluded, then they'll make a report, and if they find substantiation for the report that there is reason to believe or there's evidence to substantiate the allegations. And keep in mind, when there's a report or an allegation to the hotline, then it's an allegation that has to be investigated, and there will be no further action unless and until the Department of Health and Senior Services makes a finding that the allegation is substantiated. That's the due process. Now, that also is true in other investigations of child abuse and other adult abuse of individuals who are other than the elderly and the disabled. In my practice, I have represented clients who were either witnesses or were accused of abuse or neglect, elder abuse or neglect, and you do get due process rights. So you do have the right to representation if you are the subject or an allegation of abuse or neglect has been made against you. You get the opportunity to be represented by counsel or not, and you would have the opportunity to be given notice of any allegations, and also the opportunity to be heard or to give a statement by way of interview to the investigator. In the case, one of the cases that I handled for a client who was accused of abuse, the investigator, he was interviewed. He agreed to be interviewed in the presence of counsel. I was present, and the investigator from the Department of Health and Senior Services, I think in this case, it may have been the Division of Children's Services, who were conducting the investigation. They did an interview in the presence of counsel, and the accused, my client, had the opportunity to give a statement and to defend himself in that instance. So you're always offered due process rights, which is that's your constitutional right. So keep that in mind if you are there's been an allegation of abuse or neglect that's been made against you. And so that investigation, they'll do their due diligence in conducting and completing the investigation. So that is some of the highlights about protections for elder abuse and neglect. Again, we invite you to send us your comments or any questions you have on this topic or any other topic. So that would conclude our discussion on our topic for today. We want to thank everyone for watching this broadcast now, and of course those of you who will be watching the broadcast later for watching. We appreciate it, and we thank you, and we hope you'll tune in for our next broadcast. And remember, when you fight, know your rights.